Welcome to the Softland Central podcast, your home for market entry knowledge and resources. Softland Central is brought to you by Softland Partners, an online marketplace to help you find best fit resources for your market entry. Find them at softlandpartners.com. Hi, and welcome to Softland Central, the hub of market entry. So it's my pleasure today to welcome an incredible team of attorneys from Osborne Clarke, just a fantastic law firm based in the UK. And I'm going to say welcome to Jonathan Mills, Tim Rezendes, and also William Devenish. Welcome, guys. How are you?
Hi, Bill. Good to be here.
Yeah, really good. Thanks. I was just waiting for Will to take himself off mute.
Yeah, you'd think I would have got used to taking myself off mute whilst we've been in lockdown. Embarrassing not, but thanks for having us, Bill. It's great to be here.
Oh, absolutely. Well, let's start with you, Will, since you are unmuted. Can you tell us just a little bit about your background? It'd be great to give context so as we get into our topics, folks know about what you do.
Yeah, sure. I'll let Tim give a bit more of an overview on Osborne Clarke generally, but me specifically, I'm a UK qualified lawyer. I'm based in the San Francisco Bay Area, working out of our San Francisco and Palo Alto offices. And my role really boils down to two things. Firstly, I counsel US businesses, predominantly VC-backed high growth businesses, on their expansion into new markets across Europe and Asia. And the second role that I perform for some of our larger clients is I effectively act as their external outsourced international legal counsel. So a single point of contact for all their international legal work.
Oh, that's fantastic. So great. Why don't we go to Jonathan, and then we'll finish up with Tim, and Tim can tell us more about Osborne Clarke as well. So Jonathan, how about yourself?
Absolutely. Thanks, Bill. So I'm a real estate lawyer from London by trade, and back at HQ, I advise on a variety of property-related matters, so investment, development, real estate tech, and energy and utilities. My specific focus is on the alternative residential market, so co-living, student accommodation, build-to-rent or multifamily, as they call it here in the US, and assisted living and care. However, I'm currently based in sunny Brooklyn and assisting Tim and the team on the ground on the East Coast. And my focus here is assisting US real estate businesses with their European operations. And so whether that's existing business or similar to Will, sort of international expansion and growth. And it tends to be in the US sort of fast growth part of the real estate business, whether that's real estate tech or investors and operators in that alternative residential space.
Fantastic. I'd imagine there's some really interesting things going on in real estate tech right now, for sure.
Absolutely, yeah.
And Tim, do you want to round us out here? Tell us about yourself, and then about Osborne Clarke.
Sure. Thanks, Bill. So I'm Tim Rezendes, VP Legal International, based in our New York office. Been with the firm for about 8 years now. I'm the only American lawyer in the firm as far as I know, because we have a very unique model, which I'll go into a bit more depth, but primarily spent the past decade advising fast-growing US companies as they're expanding outside the US, both for the first time and just doing initial market entry projects, so going and setting up an overseas sales office, and then in many cases we're advising them as they're doing multi-market projects, expanding into new jurisdictions across the world, and then helping them as they scale up globally. I've been doing that for about 10 years and solely doing it for US-based companies going outside the US. So it's very much a niche in which we sit within the market, and being within time zone helps us be close to our clients, to be understanding what a US company's needs are, how they take their legal advice, how they like to operate, how we can best service them, and then being super responsive because we're in the time zone. So we're working the same hours they are, and then coordinating with lawyers around the world to deliver for them. So about the firm, it's a unique platform in the US market where we don't practice US law at all, but we're a good sized firm of about 1,100, 1,200 lawyers spread across 25 offices, primarily in Europe with offices across Asia as well, the US offices in Silicon Valley and on the East Coast as well. And we have this unique niche we fill where we're only advising US companies, primarily with international lawyers spread across the world on the ground, and then us as the in-time zone advisors. And then we're advising across a range of issues, whether it's market entry projects where we all sit in the world, but also on bigger issues as companies scale up, whether it's litigation, M&A, things like privacy laws around the world are becoming much stricter, the regulatory environment, things like employment, helping them with day-to-day business issues as they arise. We work across a few sectors. I'd say in the US, tech is by far our largest. So our tech, media, and communications sector, which Will can tell you just a bit more about that on the West Coast. But then we do a lot in retail, life sciences, financial services, and real estate, where Jonathan sits as well. And then the only other thing to mention is on the flip side, since we're here on the ground in the US market, the majority of the firm's clients sit somewhere else in the world, whether that's the UK, continental Europe, or Asia. And when they come into the US market, we help them hold their hand a bit just to be helpful in the market, connect them with the right advisors. Since we don't practice, we're primarily helping them navigate the US market, and it's a nice value add for existing clients at the firm.
Fantastic. And Will, do you want to add anything on the, that obviously you're in the bastion of technology in Silicon Valley. Do you want to add anything on the types of clients you work with there and the practice in Silicon Valley?
Sure. So the practice is primarily very similar to what Tim's just described. Our clients typically are technology businesses, venture-backed, high growth, predominantly based in the Bay Area, although increasingly across all of the West Coast. So other markets that we see a lot of demand for is Seattle, Santa Barbara, Los Angeles, and Denver and Colorado. And the team here has been, we've had offices in the Bay Area for 20 years now. It's our 20th anniversary this year of being in the US, and we had a big party planned, and then obviously that's kind of gone out the window due to the current situation that we all find ourselves in. But we were one of the first European law firms to come here, primarily to advise those clients in time zone. And we've now got a really lean team that are in time zone that are able to provide the exact advice that our clients frequently want to be provided in time zone. So that's effectively labor law advice, data privacy advice, corporate M&A advice, and international expansion and growth advice. And then where we don't have that advice in time zone, as Tim's alluded to, what we do is we then act as that conduit for introducing our experts across Europe and Asia.
We've known each other, the three of us now, for a few months, and the thing I've really actually marveled at the way you all operate is the collaborative nature, and how much you work through partners, and you really look for sort of trusted allies and advisors that would help build value for your clients. It seems like a very much a part of the ethos of Osborne Clarke. But I see nodding heads, so yeah, that's really good. Does anyone want to make a comment on that at all?
Yeah, I will. I think you're exactly right in that, as Tim emphasized, we don't practice law in the US. We've got a fantastic network here and can be incredibly useful. As Will said, 20 years here now of building up trust in the market and building strong ties with other advisors and professionals. And given that we don't practice US law, then there needs to be a USP around what we do. And it's very much that collaborative approach and that expertise in providing a solution to our clients to what is a fairly niche part of the market.
Fantastic. So, and just to set some, sort of frame where we're going here, as you all know, the audience that we're talking to today certainly are going to be market entry and internationalizing firms and companies, as well as a community of trade and investment professionals and also other service providers. So, I think the information that you all can provide about some of the things that you're observing and seeing and helping companies with will be really helpful. And I guess the first place I really want to start off with, and maybe Tim, will start with you, is when you think about the common mistakes that you see companies that are internationalizing from the US make, what falls into that bucket of common mistakes that you see?
Sure. Yeah, there's a long list of mistakes we've seen over the years, but
We've got an
we've
hour, so.
well, I know we'll come into some of the success stories as well, which
Sure.
we can draw out some of those really best practices that we've seen emerge. And I think it's sophisticated generally in terms of this space that we all sit in as advisors in the cross-border world, helping companies as they're navigating between markets. So generally speaking, I've seen a higher level of preparation and planning and research and understanding that the product needs to fit in the right market, and then the approach needs to fit for the market. And I think the thing I would emphasize there is taking the planning and research aspects of this project much more seriously than some companies have in the past. So understanding what that market looks like, knowing what's important to you as a company, understanding what success looks like, testing a lot of the assumptions too, and then being proportional in the market by not jumping fully in if that's not the right approach, by dipping in a toe, limiting your risk initially, and saying, okay, we've done our research, we know our market, we've talked to everybody we know, and from that we're going to go in and execute on this playbook, but be in a position where we've limited our risk from the outset, where if we need to pull back we can, but also we're in a position where if things are working, we can go and double down on that. We have the resource or the operational framework in place to be able to go double down on that. I'd say the biggest issue is just a company that doesn't plan ahead or assumes that the overseas market or doing business in an overseas market is the same in the US.
Mm-hmm.
In many cases, in a place like the UK, where it is pretty similar, but it's all just a little bit different. And knowing the nuances of that, even in a market that's one of the easier ones to operate in, is really key for success. And if you're maybe learning in the UK as a starting market to see, okay, what works there, it's a little bit different. Okay, the words mean something a little bit different, and the process a bit different to do things. That then gets a bit more complicated as you continue expanding around the world. So I think it's just the planning, preparation, knowing before you go, and knowing that it's going to be different, whatever it is, and trying to figure out what those issues are that are going to really crop up.
So, what did Winston Churchill say? Two countries separated by a common language. But so what you're saying is research is probably the biggest challenge or mistake, lack of detailed research and testing, and then sort of localizing, understanding the local, whether it's regulatory environment or legal environment or whatnot, but the ability to sort of translate your business structure successfully into that new market, and having enough information to do that well. Are those kind of the two big challenges you see?
Yeah, I think that's right. And localizing probably both in the aspect of understanding that market and localizing your approach to it, but also localizing even your product and your people. If you're selling into Germany, do you need German people to sell into that market? So localizing the approach for that market, and then looking at your product. Does that work? Do we need to add languages, currencies? If we're talking software, thinking about every market you enter around the world, that product market fit that you have in the US that you've established here before you go overseas, that needs to still work. And then the approach to really deploy that effectively in the market might need to change to be localized. And you need to do that prep ahead of time in order to really do that effectively.
Sure. And Will, how are you seeing additional challenges or mistakes that some of the companies that you're working with make, or companies you have worked with in the past make when they're entering new markets?
So there's two things I'd probably add to what Tim says. Completely agree with everything that he's mentioned. One of them's slightly connected, is actually understanding the culture and knowing the market that you're going into, just from a cultural perspective. We've seen it time and time again where, one of the biggest decisions to make is, do you send a US national that understands your business into that market to try and grow the market, or do you hire someone locally that understands the market but doesn't understand the business to try and grow the business? And actually, there's probably no real right answer there in terms of, it's not a one size fits all. It's an approach that will vary by company. The ones that we've probably seen, though, that have been the most success have been those that have taken that kind of hybrid approach of doing both. So they'll send a senior person that's worked at the company for a number of years. And I think realistically, they probably do have to be relatively senior. We have seen some companies that have sent very young people over. Great, you know, when I was 23, 24, I would have loved to have been given an expat package and sent over to London, or vice versa, sent to New York to live for 4 or 5 years. But I think they do need to be relatively senior and understand the culture, but then also make sure that you hire a really good general manager within the country that you land in that understands how the market works, because there are nuances. Tim's kind of alluded to, you know, if you're going into Germany, do you really want to be trying to sell into that market without understanding the German culture? The second thing I'd say is appear on the regulator's radar when you want to appear on it. It's very, very easy from a legal position to accidentally end up you know, creating a presence in a new jurisdiction without intending to, and that has knock-on tax and legal consequences. So we kind of often say you don't want to be an accidental tourist, and that's where the planning comes in, right? It's really simple to just say, you know, we'll just put someone on the next flight from SFO over to Frankfurt, and they'll go out on the market, you know, on a tourist visa, and no one will really care. But unfortunately, the authorities do care. So it's about planning that in and really appearing on the market when you want to appear, not by accident appearing on the radar.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. So Jonathan, with real estate, I would imagine there are some really unique things that you're looking at in terms of how companies are, you know, sort of what challenges real estate companies see. Are there some unique things that are going on in real estate that would be good to chat about from a standpoint of where the challenges are?
Yeah, so what's interesting in terms of real estate that doesn't necessarily appear across some of the tech verticals and software businesses that we work with is that as opposed to having a fantastic product, it's usually a plan and a deal that will take a real estate company into other jurisdictions. So yes, they'll be very good at what they do in the US. Let's take a multifamily business, for example. So a multifamily developer operator. They could be fantastic in the US, and not even that they have to have the layer that Will and Tim mentioned, which is knowing their market, understanding their product, how that fits in that market. But then also there's the next part of what is their customer base. Their customer base is people who want to live in houses. It's individual people. It's homes are what make people's lives tick. We've particularly seen that performance across the real estate market during the pandemic. And so it's slightly different in that the market is there, but it's how you tailor your product to that market that then brings you success. And that's why generally real estate businesses will be slightly more tactical with their move into new jurisdictions. It will likely be done with a partner or with a particular deal in mind, a particular location that they want to focus on, that they feel their product fits best. So for example, in the UK, do they go to London where maybe their target audience largely sits and there are large sums of capital, but in fact, does their product fit a lot better in one of the secondary cities where perhaps land prices are slightly lower, development costs are slightly lower, and margins therefore could be slightly higher, or the tolerance and risk baked into their move is then there's a touch more fat there, slightly higher numbers and percentages to play with. Whereas on the flip side, the similarity to what Tim and Will were saying is the real rise we've seen in real estate tech, which is only going to be pushed on by the pandemic as people see the need for not only technology like that is pandemic specific, like touchless access and things like that, but just driving efficiencies into a market that may well struggle post lockdown being loosened. So the real estate market, where margins and numbers were fairly tight anyway, is there now a need? And yes, there is a need for efficiencies, further efficiency to be driven into the model by technology, and then you're coming up against companies with a more software focus. They're software companies that are selling into the real estate vertical, and so then it becomes a product play as opposed to a deal play or a market play. And so there really is a big cross sector, and we sort of straddle all aspects of the market at Osborne Clarke, not only in terms of sort of European specialism, but also in terms of helping US businesses to overcome their teething pains in terms of growth and expansion as well.
Interesting. So when you're talking about sort of plan or deal centered, I guess what the words that popped up in my head is that at least in some cases, some of these real estate opportunities, the international opportunities, are demand driven. In other words, they're really trying to identify which I suppose in most cases, all sales are demand driven, but before you go and buy or invest in building a new complex or buy an existing set of buildings, it's really making sure that the renters are there, the customers are there to fill that space. Is that part of what you're seeing? Is that from a solution standpoint or overcoming the mistakes? That's what people are doing, is really validating the demand before going into it?
You're absolutely right. And there are a couple of key asset classes at the moment which there is particular demand for, and it's demand that was building in any event and is heightened by the pandemic and the lockdown. So it's areas like industrial and sort of the related e-commerce, a lot more delivery going on than there was previously. The whole infrastructure business around that is growing exponentially, and that's become an incredibly hot market. But then you look at other areas that the pandemic has shone a light on, particularly taking the conversation back to housing, and Tim and I work quite closely in this sector, but it's co-living, the sort of co-living movement, and which is particularly large in the US and New York in particular. And there are operators that are looking at other markets so that they can overlay the business that they have here and the expertise that they've built up over a common product and a common ideology in other key locations that have, one, the demographic, but two, also the underlying requirements for those businesses. And so for anybody on the listening in that isn't aware of co-living or how it works, it's essentially, people phrase it as institutionalized room sharing, which I think is to do it a slight disservice. It's a branch of multifamily wherein individuals will live together in the same apartment. They will share common facilities, and in living in that way, and the demographic that it tends to attract, which is generally sort of age 25 to 35, usually grads or starter positions in white collar businesses. Though that's the sort of target demographic, and in living in that way, it also fosters sort of relationships and community and a communal way of living as well. And it's become incredibly popular, not only as a way of living, but an affordable way of living in the US. And it's very much catching on in parts of Europe, and catching on because there is demand for an affordable solution to what is a housing crisis in many key European cities as well.
Interesting. Yeah, and sort of to your, besides the real estate side, the real estate technology, it seems like there are probably some really good solutions that would either be available already in that space or coming in terms of matching co-livers and so on. There must be.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and it's a part of the real estate industry which is uncommon for real estate, is actually laden with technology. And so when you meet our clients in the area and you have discussions, you won't be speaking to a head of real estate and a head of a certain area of the US or someone from their employment team. You'd also be sitting with someone from the tech team, a head of product. There's such a tech layer into the efficiencies that they try to build into that business to be able to offer the affordability that they can, that, as you say, there's very much several different layers that come into the business and several different platforms at play as well.
Cool. One more quick question for you, and it may not be super quick, but it is just thinking about the technology companies that you're working with and that you see in the marketplace. What are you had outlined some of the challenges and really the market opportunity right now with technology creating some efficiencies, and you can see them from maintenance to access and all those types of things. But when you think about some of the challenges those companies have in market entry, what are some of the sort of direct actions that you all help with to overcome those challenges?
So I think the first, and Tim and Will have both touched on it, is the first thing to understand and absolutely understand in any market entry or expansion into new markets is that the market is king. It's understanding how you fit into that market, not necessarily how you're going to change that market. I think so. Understanding the market that you're getting into and how your business fits within it, and the interplay with the demand that you're expecting and the demand that actually exists and how it exists really is the key. In terms of what we do to advise businesses, I think it's the first thing is to understand the breadth of the task at hand, and understanding how many different parts already existing in your US business. And so some of the things that we bring to the attention of a client, as to Will's point earlier, some people see international expansion as putting a guy on a flight who's particularly in tune with your business, putting him on the ground and having him arrange 10 meetings a day with people in whichever sector he's focusing. Whereas in actual fact, there are so many key considerations, and not even necessarily legal considerations, but it's things like advertising, marketing, localization of contracts, IP, brand and data management and protection. People is always a big one. Not only is talent key to growing a business, but making sure you understand the market that talent sits within is key. So employment at will in the US, that doesn't exist anywhere else. So it's understanding what does exist in the market that you're moving into. Then there's obviously regulation on top of that, regulation of your particular market, tax issues, something that Tim and I were speaking about recently. We see people put these incredibly complicated tax or offshore structures in place that cost hundreds of thousands of legal and professional dollars to tie up and finalize, but that company is not going to be profitable for 5 years. And so it's almost a front end waste of money you're really not going to see any benefit from for a number of years. So we always advise to not only to think about the market and always think local, but also to think early as well. To Tim's point earlier, it's all about planning and making sure you understand the task at hand and how many different moving parts there are.
I love your statement, the market is king, right? And that sort of all the planning comes from that. It seems so simple, but I guess an observation, very few people observe that because they're used to the Steve Jobs model where Steve Jobs had his ability to sort of create markets with his force of will, but there probably was only one person that in our lifetime that probably had that force of will. So,
and I think that's why we have disruptors as well, because it happens. It's so few and far between that companies really do change a market or the way that a market operates. That a very bright light is shone on them.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, Tim, let's pop back over to you. And one of the things you had talked about was research, which we certainly. In talking to so many folks, see that as sort of a very common challenge that companies that are internationalizing have. But what are some of the things that you all do to help companies, whether it's directly with the research or indirectly, to sort of support making sure the research happens, so that to Jonathan's point, that the risk is reduced as companies globalize? What are some of the steps that you would take?
Yeah, I think that it's all about that risk mitigation, that we're talking about the market being king. I mean, mistakes are going to happen no matter what, and no matter how much planning you put in place. And I think we'll come on to it, but mistakes happen, but the macro environment might change. We're in a global pandemic right now, so whatever your plan was, it's probably changed by now, or your playbook will need to adjust as things change. And so it's always about doing the research, but then being nimble and flexible in order to deal with that as it comes up. What I like to recommend in terms of the research is talk to everybody you know. So let's say I'm at a fast growing tech company and they say, okay, Tim, you're off. You got to go figure out how we're going to go set up in this market, drive revenue, be successful, lay the structural framework and operational side of the business to be successful. Start talking to absolutely everybody you know that's ever done this before, whether it's at peer companies in your particular sector, in your area, advisors like us that have done it before and can obviously help advise around the pitfalls, help set what a plan should look like. A lot of what we do is actually for companies, especially in retail or consumer products, when they're really going into the market and they need a proper launch plan other than just we're going to hire a salesperson and hopefully they'll be successful, is we put in a fully scoped market entry plan that covers the legal aspects of it, but also touches on a number of other things that probably fall more into the camp of accountants, tax advisors, people like that that can help on some initial structuring, but also ongoing operations. People that can help on payroll and HR. Jonathan touched on the people being important, and Will mentioned talent as a key to success. Banking is a common pitfall we find around the world. Setting up bank accounts and being able to be operational is a big, big challenge. So talk to whoever your current bank is, see if they can help you over in that market. If they can't, who else could you be using there, and start early because the timeline for that can take a significant amount of time. But then in terms of the market, I think that's also talking to either other advisors or consultants that specialize in this, looking at where your either competitor companies or peer companies are, what markets are they in, how have they deployed their solution into that market, how many people do they have there, how long have they've been there. Ring somebody up if you have a connection on LinkedIn that looks like they're involved in that, to see what you can learn. So it's really anything and everything. And then I think just being systematic about it to see, okay, here's our playbook we're putting together, our launch plan and our strategy. Let's validate this. And it could change based on both those initial pieces of research, but then also what you see on the ground. So if you deploy into a market, you've had a sales team on the ground for a year and you haven't seen much revenue yet. It could be the market, it could have been lack of planning, but it could also just be, well, that market, the sales cycle is 18 months instead of 6 months, as you might be used to in the US, which we see a lot in software, B2B software sales in continental Europe, for instance. Common pitfall, somebody will walk away either blaming lack of preparation or the market. But in many cases, it really is knowing that market, knowing that in advance, but then also being nimble enough to test that. If it doesn't work, figure out what the issue is. It's kind of that tech philosophy about failing fast. There's going to be issues that will trip you up no matter what it is. Prepare in advance, stay nimble as the market changes or information comes to light, then be able to quickly pivot and change into something that you think will work, and keep testing that and test the assumptions around it too. We've seen companies we worked with for over 10 years to help them initially set up, or we're still advising them on a number of issues, and everybody's still figuring it out. And we just had a curveball of a global pandemic that changed the entire playbook for how you go to market, how you operate, whether it's domestically or overseas. So there will always be issues no matter how much preparation you have.
Other thing just to say to that is that the way you enter the market will vary depending on which country you're going to. So we've had some really good examples of clients over the year. For example, obviously we can't name names, but say a technology company that works in the travel sector that decided to enter one market in continental Europe by acquiring a competitor, then decided to enter the UK market by essentially sending over that senior person that I was talking about earlier, and that understood the company culture, and then working with a general manager in the UK to build the business organically. So there's a number of different approaches to take depending on which market you're going to. So don't just think, oh, because we've had success in Germany, for example, that automatically means we're going to have success in Italy. You've got to be as Tim says, you've got to be nimble and flexible around all of that.
No, that totally makes sense. Thanks for hopping in with that, Will. And I'd actually maybe take both of those points, because I think that the notion of having hypotheses and testing and making sure that you're investing sort of as it makes sense to invest makes a lot of sense. And I guess I'd love, in any of the three or all of the three, you can react to this, is where does ego come into this formula? Because it seems we all see people who are working on testing assumptions, and others who sort of have their plan and they sort of go in, like they're going to Las Vegas, pushing all the chips to one color, and and off they go. So where does ego come into this notion of globalizing, and how have you seen sort of companies manage that well? Anyone?
Yeah, I'll chip in on this. I think I'm sure it's changed over the years as the risk profile of going international has changed and is seen as a riskier move because markets are so different. But I think a CEO's ego will always be tempered by its investors. And so we find in a lot of circumstances now, particularly the clients we work with, yes, the venture investors are very keen to obviously make money on their investment, but they're also very keen to protect their investment, particularly in the economic cycles that we've had over the last 20 years. And there's a lot more careful thought and planning that comes from an investor side now, whereas in the 2000s, there was always the joke that venture backers were pushing these tech companies into Europe as fast as they could to double down on their results and to double down on their investment. But now the VC companies that we work with or that we speak with in the US market are now, reserved is the wrong phrase, but they're very tactical and methodical about how they go about their business. They're very careful with their dollars, and they look to very much understand the US business and how that works first, before then looking to push anybody into new horizons and new jurisdictions. That will the CEO's remit, I would argue, will be tightened and the noose shorter than it was post COVID as well. Particularly some of the areas that venture capital money was focused on pre-COVID, some areas have taken quite a large hit as in the pandemic. So particularly that sort of leisure and hospitality sector, where we've seen real heavy layoffs. Not that people won't be willing to invest in those areas, or that product doesn't fit in new markets, but it'll be a very careful, very meticulous process that sits behind any new market entry, I think.
Cool.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add there is that the global pandemic has a way of kind of knocking that hubris out of you that we see when times get frothy, when the VC money is flowing. And one example I remember that was seemed like an ego-driven move by a US company that had a German competitor. They were a product company, had raised 200 or 300 million at the time. And so we're going to go acquire them. We're going to scale up and do this massive operation. I think they hired something like 200 people within a year, which that's not how it's typically done. That's kind of the opposite of the approach we've been talking about being proportional, knowing the market, testing it, and then growing. And that was one that really crashed and burned. And it was during a time when a lot of companies we were coming out of the financial crisis. We were a few years out, and most companies are, I think, right where we are, where it's, okay, there's some optimism, there's going to be some growth, and we're going overseas to chase revenue. We have investor support, but it's also tempered. We're not in the market that's growth at all costs right now. It's, okay, what's working? What do we need to do to change? What can we do overseas that's different than we're currently doing it, or do we need to start looking there? But I have seen those examples, especially when times are very, very good, and it's just go into a new market, put a team on the ground, And for us, we've seen some of those examples where it might be a regulated market, and you should be working with, let's say, the local government or understanding the regulatory market there to make sure your product's going to work, instead of just kind of going in and taking things on and then hoping it all works out as things shake out. I think we've kind of pulled back from that, which that very growth at all costs kind of a phase. And so hopefully, as Jonathan was saying, with the VCs reevaluating current investments and thinking where it makes sense to double down or continue pushing those forward, I think we're in a pretty good environment right now where we've all had to reassess our businesses, all of us, and what's working and what's not. And so that kind of takes the ego out of it. Everybody kind of gets knocked down, even if you've been one of the few very, very successful companies in the current environment. I think we're all dealing with a new environment and shifting, whatever that happens to be, whether it's domestically with our domestic business or how we're doing things overseas.
Cool. So, Will, let's shift over to you, and maybe there's and I know you can't talk about specific clients, but is there an unnamed client sort of case study that you'd like to share of a client that you kind of really feel did it well in terms of their sort of move from the US into the European market?
Yeah, sure. So there are a number of examples, but one that, and I'll let the others chip in with their examples as well. But one that particularly springs to mind is a company, Silicon Valley based technology company that we've helped for a number of years, that have just gone about things in that methodical, planned way. The CFO has been at the forefront of the international expansion drive alongside the general counsel, the two working in partnership together, both having worked at previous companies where they helped scale internationally. And that experience really helps. So I think, we kind of touched on it earlier, but making sure that we build a team around you that has the experience of international really helps as well. And then what they've done is they've gone into 6, 7, 8 jurisdictions now, and they've got that roadmap, right? And that roadmap is now flexible enough to appreciate that if I'm going into an Asian jurisdiction versus South American jurisdiction, there's going to be some slight changes that need to be made. But they know they've got their ducks in a row on everything. They'll send a country manager across that from the West Coast that understands the company culture. They'll make that general manager hire as well locally. They'll start building out sales. They'll make sure that their tax side of things is all well laid out. They'll make sure they create an entity locally rather than creating a branch, which obviously has its own risks, versus using contractors, which is super tempting when you've got someone in the C-suite that's saying, we need to be in the, Spanish market yesterday. So hire all these people, salespeople as contractors. Well, we all know the issues, or if you don't know the issues, there's various resources you can go to, but there are a number of issues around using contractors internationally, pretty much the same issues that you get in the States. So they've really thought about it, and they've taken the time to create that roadmap and make a flexible roadmap. And I think that's meant they've had real success internationally. Another example would be going back to my earlier example of companies that will appreciate that different markets need to be treated differently. So I think that's another trap that we see a lot of people fall into. They'll go, hey, we've been fantastically successful in the UK market, right? So now we're going to go into France. And they don't really take into account that, despite the fact that at the closest point, there's only 20 miles between the two countries, across a tiny bit of water, there's actually huge differences in the culture and how businesses operated there. So I think that's really important, is being able to pivot and have that flexibility, really. To go, okay, well, we're going into France, but we'll do it via an acquisition rather than via organic growth or whatever it may be. So, or a JV. So there's a whole way of approaching this slightly different, but it all comes down to being planned and having the flexibility to change your plan as well as you're growing and going along, which just comes back directly to Jonathan and Tim's points earlier as well.
That makes sense. So it really all starts with leadership and having the right right team in place, which totally makes sense. I'm a sailor, so always good to have the right skipper or captain. And Tim, how about you? A client that you particularly think of that got it right?
Yeah, sure. I think I'll bring up one that helps hammer home that point about preparation, planning, using data, understanding the market before you go. That I think helps to illuminate that a bit. The one I have in mind was a fast-growing, venture-backed, direct-to-consumer apparel company. So originally they started just selling online by e-commerce domestically in the US. As that was successful, they put in pop-up shops in the US in kind of key cities, and then we're using that to build the brand across those markets. And so when they started to look outside the US, and that's a typical trajectory we see. It's product into the US market, see some success, raise another round, a venture round off the back of that in order to, drive that more widely across North America, but then also look to further markets, let's say Europe. So what they did is they set up the entire e-commerce distribution and the marketing to go after the European market and the Asian markets to see, we think we can be successful. We don't know exactly where our key markets will be, but we'll set up the e-commerce layer of the business so that we can fulfill product and be able to service those markets, and then have the marketing machine turned on so we can go into the market, and wherever we see that demand, we'll go and double down on that. So it's a nice business to be in, where you can set up the e-commerce layer, build revenue overseas, start to see where it's working and where it's not. And amazingly, there were some surprises. It wasn't the places around the world you would have thought that would be the trendy apparel company would be going. And so then they would set up pop-up shops initially. So that's dipping the toe in the water to not commit to a long-term retail lease, but to put a pop-up, do some brand building, have a new distribution channel in the market. And then if that itself was very successful, then go double down on that, take a longer-term lease, brick and mortar, because they had enough learnings from that to know what worked in that specific market. And so utilizing that, we put together the whole kind of launch plan for these markets, and then we've been executing along the way when we hit certain metrics in terms of demand and saying, now it's time to go. Let's figure out what the next stage is, whether it's turning on e-commerce, doing pop-ups, doing full-scale brick and mortar, and then maybe taking it to the next level with more marketing or product line extensions and things like that overseas. So that was a really interesting one, where it was all data-based and demand-driven, but in a way that was able to test the market and then really double down and scale up off the back of it.
It's a really interesting point, Tim, just exemplifying how data and data analytics are coming into this process more and more. And there is, if you understand how to build it, there is a wealth of data that you can pull together to educate your entry into new markets as well, and that can be invaluable.
Yeah, and I would imagine to that point, Jonathan, is that it's also, what are you putting out there that you're testing? So it's, and are you doing, A/B testing, so you're getting that comparatives? I mean, I think to Tim's point, the company went in sort of broadly into Europe and saw, essentially where the demand was and made decisions based on that. But yeah, I think it really seems very intriguing to have that ability to, especially with the digital platforms, to be able to get all that data and make those demand-based decisions. But is there an example you'd want to share, Jonathan, in terms of clients you've worked with and someone that got it right?
To be honest, I think the guys have covered off a lot of the examples that I would have used or spoken to. Something else we've touched on tech a lot, and the future of developing and expanding business in the way that we've been discussing. But one thing that I wanted to touch on, which is sort of as old as business itself, but often gets lost in the landscape at the moment, and something that we really like to do at Osborne Clarke, and you touched on earlier, Bill, in the collaborative way that we like to go about our business, but we really like to share our network with clients to make sure that they can scale and grow in a curated way with the correct advisors around them. And unlike either some other law firms or other businesses in the internationalization space and the growth and expansion space, we tend not to have any exclusive relationships with other partners to force our hand in a certain direction, but we tend to always be looking for sort of best choice and best in breed in partners to recommend to our clients, as there's nothing more powerful than being able to open up a part of your network that can help and assist with the growth of that business at no cost as well. And so taking a real estate example, a lot of our clients that come in from the US or real estate tech businesses, they're selling into a real estate vertical, whereas at Osborne Clarke, unusually for a law firm, a high proportion of our revenue, particularly in the UK, comes from real estate. And so we're very well placed to make introductions and to introduce to potential new partners and potential new customers as well, which is something that is obviously not free in terms of time, but is of no cost to us, and generally is well received on all sides. And it really having the right partners, just like having the right advice, is crucial to an efficient scaling and expansion of business.
Well, that's actually the perfect segue to my next question, which I think I met Tim first of the three of you, and it was funny when we started this organization, Softland Partners, and it was I think I got about half the explanation out of what it was we were trying to do, and he said, "I'm in." What was it you're doing again? But it was that sort of acknowledgement, I think, exactly of what you're talking about, that the network and the peers and resources that we can bring to bear for our clients is critically important, and ultimately, when our clients grow, that's good for everybody, essentially, and their success is good for everybody. But I'll direct this question to Tim first, and just maybe to shift gears for a moment and just talk a little bit about what is it at Softland Partners that got you excited and interested when you kind of first heard about it? How do you see that sort of fitting what you all are looking to do in your ethos?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting. I've been in this space for almost 12 years now, and was previously with a foreign government economic development agency. So came from that side to get into the industry with a legal background. And so then ended up back at a law firm, but in a fully cross-border practice. So I've seen it from a few different sides, but I've never seen an organization that's focused on bringing those type of networks together. The service providers, advisors like us that help execute on that, the governments that are attracting investment, the companies in the space that are interested in international markets and are doing cross-border business. There's a whole ecosystem out there that I think we've all kind of come across or met various people within it, but we've never really had a focal point, whether that's in a specific market, New York where I sit, or Silicon Valley where Will is. That's really brought it together in any cohesive way. And I think that was the thing I got excited about, because the network is so important. We are never the only advisor our clients are working with or even talking to. We're always going to be working alongside people, and many times it's people we've come across, but in other cases there are people that we can meet that can be helpful to our clients, or that we can make helpful referrals to people in the network and help kind of spread that out, because we add more value to our clients by leveraging our network. And if we can have that network that's very validated, we have strong relationships, and we can team up to advise companies in the space, it works really well. And I feel like Softland Partners has been a good way to bring all that together in a way that it never has. And I know we're still at the beginning stages of it, but it's been great to see everybody come together. And that's why I think I introduced you to Will, and now Will's a chapter leader in San Francisco.
Well, that was my next question, is at what moment did Will become so crazy that he said, all right, not only is it a good idea, but how do I run the San Francisco chapter? So Will, thanks for, number one, for taking that on. But what was it? Obviously it's sort of a whole nother level of commitment to say, I want to sort of lead a chapter and take that on. But what was it about the promise, if you will, that made that interesting for you?
I think, having operated in the space for a while, it's the fact that we've heard a lot of horror stories ourselves about people that get suckered in, possibly to a really slick sales pitch, and then they end up spending, they want to expand quickly, and they end up spending hundreds of thousands, well, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars expanding, and it's just not successful. And when you get down to it and you start speaking to these people, it's just because they've not had the right advisors around them. And so to have that group really, especially in Silicon Valley, where, you know, every venture-backed company is really looking to eventually go international, sooner, sooner probably rather than later. To have that kind of resource where, you know, they've got the comfort of knowing that there is a network of curated professionals that have all got experience of operating in this space, and, you know, to be able to really take advantage of that and understand that all those people that are surrounding them, all those intermediaries and service providers that are supporting them, have all been there, done that, they're experts in their field. And that effectively, you know, there's this myth, isn't there, that international expansion has, you know, has this crazy headache that, you know, is going to soak up time and it's going to cost you a lot of money. And the reality is, you know, I think we would all say, the four of us, and also all of those peers that belong to the Softland community, that it doesn't have to be like that. As long as you get the right people around you. And I think that's the great thing. It's Softland's bringing all of those right people together to help companies succeed internationally.
You took the sort of the words right out of my mouth. I mean, it's funny. The thing that actually catalyzed us to start Softland Partners was a client of ours from Australia who spent $1.2 million on 2 failed U.S. market entry attempts, and actually got connected to a few bad actors, and you know, from 10,000 miles away, it could have been unintentional bad actors, but, you know, still, just the horror stories around that were just horrific. I mean, it couldn't have been worse. I'm amazed that you know, that they agreed to a 3rd attempt, but you know, thankfully they're doing very well now. But yeah, it doesn't have to be hard, for sure. But it's great to hear your comments. And Jonathan, you're not only involved in New York and in the Boston chapters, but you're soon to be moving back to London to get involved in that community. So what are your thoughts about kind of what kind of values that you see coming from some of the relationships you're creating?
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, spreading myself very thin. No. What I really like about Softland, and without naming names, when comparing to other similar groups, is that it's growing very organically. In that there's not a threshold that you need to meet to be a member. It's just an interest in and to be part in the international expansion community, which is a great tool for us at Osborne Clarke, because we have, even with outbound clients, it's a variety of sizes of client with different ambitions and scale to their growth. Same with our clients, as Tim mentioned, we act as a conduit for our clients coming into the US market as well, to introduce them to people. And we need to know a really good cross sector of the market. So they need accountancy advice. Do they need to go to one of the big 4 who will know people at? Do they need to go to a middle market firm, or do they need a fairly local practice, because actually their version of international expansion is selling online into the US market, and they just need a bit of help to make sure they're not falling foul of anything local? And so it's that cross sector, and legal advice is the same. Does somebody need a big international practice to help them, or in fact are they opening one small retail store in Chicago, and so just need a local firm to help them with their leasing? It's a trial product for them. They don't want to pay tens of thousands of dollars in fees. And so for me, and I know the guys agree, it's the really nice cross sector of people that are passionate and interested in sort of our focus area that I've really enjoyed about Softland.
Oh, cool. Well, thank you. Thank you all for those comments. And I couldn't be more excited and tickled to be working with you, each of you. You guys have shared over the last 60 minutes, have shared an incredible amount of wisdom and just I think sage advice. And thank you all for that. It's been great. So any parting thoughts, any just 10-second thoughts anyone wants to share to sum things up? We'll take that as a no. I see all the mics with red marks, so I'm going to sign us off. Please come back to our next webinar and podcast. Just like us, and we'll make sure that you're in the know on all the next great content. So thank you all for being with us today, and we'll see you real soon.
Wonderful.
One-way ticket,